Trip hammer. A trip hammer, also known as a tilt hammer or helve hammer, is a massive powered hammer. Traditional uses of trip hammers include pounding, decorticating, and polishing of grain in agriculture. In mining, trip hammers were used for crushing metal ores into small pieces, although a stamp mill was more usual for this. In finery forges, they were used for drawing out blooms made from wrought iron into more workable bar iron. They were also used for fabricating various articles of wrought iron, latten, an early form of brass, steel, and other metals. One or more trip hammers were set up in a forge, also known variously as a hammer mill, hammer forge, or hammer works. The hammers were usually raised by a cam and then released to fall under the force of gravity. Historically, trip hammers were often powered hydraulically by a water wheel. Trip hammers are known to have been used in Imperial China since the Western Han Dynasty. They also existed in the contemporary Greco-Roman world, with more evidence of their use in medieval Europe during the 12th century. During the Industrial Revolution, the trip hammer fell out of favor and was replaced with the power hammer. Often multiple hammers were powered via a set of line shafts, pulleys, and belts from a centrally located power supply. Early history: China, Europe, Greco-Roman world. The main components for water-powered trip hammers, water wheels, cams, and hammers were already known in Hellenistic times. Early cams are in evidence in water-powered automata from the 3rd century BC. One Greek automaton in particular, a flute player whose mechanism was described by the Banu Musa but can be reasonably attributed to Apollonius of Perge, functions on the principle of water-powered trip hammers. The Roman scholar Pliny Natural History 18.97 indicates that water-driven pestles had become fairly widespread in Italy by the 1st century AD. The greater part of Italy uses an unshod pestle, and also wheels which water turns as it flows past, and a trip hammer mola. While some scholars have viewed this passage to mean a watermill, recent scholarship argues that mola must refer to water-powered trip hammers which were used for the pounding and hulling of grain. Their mechanical character is also suggested by an earlier reference of Lucius Pomponius FL 100–85 BC to a fuller's mill, a type of mill that has been operated at all times with falling stocks. However, it has been pointed out by recent scholarship that the translation of Pomponius' fragmentary text could be faulty, and relies on translating mola, which is often thought to mean either a mill or millstone, to instead refer to a water-powered trip hammer. Grain pounders with pestles, as well as ordinary watermills, are attested as late as the middle of the 5th century AD in a monastery founded by Romanus of Condat in the remote Jura region, indicating that the knowledge of trip hammers continued into the early Middle Ages. At the Italian site of Sepidum, excavators have recently unearthed a late antique watermill that may have employed trip hammers for tanning, the earliest evidence of its kind in a classical context. The widest application of trip hammers seems to have occurred in Roman mining, where ore from deep veins was first crushed into small pieces for further processing. Here, the regularity and spacing of large indentations on stone anvils indicate the use of cam-operated ore stamps, much like the devices of later medieval mining. Such mechanically deformed anvils have been found at numerous Roman silver and gold mining sites in Western Europe, including at Dollacothy, Wales, and on the Iberian Peninsula, where the datable examples are from the 1st and 2nd century AD. At Dollacothy, these trip hammers were hydraulic-driven, and possibly also at other Roman mining sites, where the large-scale use of the hushing and ground sluicing technique meant that large amounts of water were directly available for powering the machines. However, none of the Spanish and Portuguese anvils can be convincingly associated with mill sites, though most mines had water sources and lead systems which could easily be harnessed. Likewise, the dating of the pumpsaint stone to the Roman era did not address that the stone could have been moved, and relies on a series of interlinked probabilities which would jeopardize the conclusion of a Roman dating should any of them unravel. Medieval Europe. Water-powered and mechanized trip hammers reappeared in medieval Europe by the 12th century. Their use was described in medieval written sources of Styria, in modern-day Austria, written in 1135 and another in 1175 AD. Medieval French sources of the years 1116 and 1249 both record the use of mechanized trip hammers used in the forging of wrought iron. Medieval European trip hammers by the 15th century were most often in the shape of the vertical pestle stamp mill, although they employed more frequent use of the vertical water wheel than earlier Chinese versions, which often used the horizontal water wheel. The well-known Renaissance artist and inventor Leonardo da Vinci often sketched trip hammers for use in forges, and even file-cutting machinery, those of the vertical pestle stamp mill type. The oldest depicted European illustration of a forge hammer is perhaps the description of the northern peoples of Alaus Magnus, dated to 1565 AD. In this woodcut image, there is the scene of three martinets and a water wheel working wood and leather bellows of the Osmund Bloomery furnace. The recumbent hammer was first depicted in European artwork in an illustration by Sandrart and Zonka dated 1621 AD. Types. A trip hammer has the head mounted at the end of a recumbent helve, hence the alternative name of helve hammer. The choice of which type was used in a particular context may have depended on the strain that its operation imposed on the helve. This was normally of wood mounted in a cast iron ring called the Hurst where it pivoted. However, in the 19th century the heaviest helves were sometimes a single casting, incorporating the Hurst. The tilt hammer or tail helve hammer has a pivot at the center of the helve on which it is mounted, and is lifted by pushing the opposite end to the head downwards. In practice, the head on such hammers seems to have been limited to 100 weight, about 50 kg, but a very rapid stroke rate was possible. This made it suitable for drawing iron down to small sizes suitable for the cutlery trades. There were therefore many such forges known as tilts around Sheffield. They were also used in brass battery works for making brass or copper pots and pans. In battery works at least it was possible for one power source to operate several hammers. In Germany, tilt hammers of up to 300 kg were used in hammer mills to forge iron. Surviving working hammers powered by water wheels may be seen, for example, at the Fronor hammer in the Ore Mountains. The belly helve hammer was the kind normally found in a finery forge, used for making pig iron into forgeable bar iron. This was lifted by cams striking the helve between the pivot and the head. The head usually weighed quarter of a ton. This was probably the case because the strain on a wooden helve would have been too great if the head were heavier. The nose helve hammer seems to have been unusual until the late 18th or early 19th century. This was lifted beyond the head. Surviving nose helves and those in pictures appear to be of cast iron. Demise. The steam-powered drop hammer replaced the trip hammer at least for the largest forgings. James Nasmyth invented it in 1839 and patented in 1842. However, by then forging had become less important for the iron industry, following the improvements to the rolling mill that went along with the adoption of puddling from the end of the 18th century. Nevertheless, hammers continued to be needed for shingling.